I'd like us to reconceptualize craft as it exists today in the industry that we have today. But this time, going into a deep, 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 deep dive because my background is in psychology. So we will try and understand better the people who are at the center of this all, and these are the artisans. So there's also some discussion on self-fulfillment. So we'll talk about that as well here. Okay, so the button is not working. Paano? Um, Okay, so, well, they told us to introduce ourselves, so I'll just do it very briefly. So, I've been working in the local design industry for over 7 years, and what I do is really in branding communications through a branding agency called Serious Studio, and also with Muni, which is more about sustainability communications. And we're one of the partners of this event as well. So, in my work in the industry, while I practice branding and design, I've always tried to understand how can creativity and craft have a role in achieving a sense of well-being in Filipinos, no matter who they are, which is what brought me back to my alma mater at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, where I'm now currently taking social psychology, where I'm trying to understand again Filipinos and their experience of design and creativity and craft. And in all of this, all I really want to do is understand what a good life is for Filipinos. How do we design a better life for Filipinos? Which brings me to this, Ginhawa. So Ginhawa is a Filipino, Tagalog. Well, I don't know all the languages of the Philippines, so it's Tagalog. Apparently also Cebuano, and it is loosely translated into well-being. Arguable also, some people would translate it as relief, which is totally different from like an upward idea of well-being. So it comes like us as Filipinos, is that our idea of a good life, just relief? So that's one of the things that I try to tackle in my work. And in this particular research, and I believe that this is the kind of framework that I'll adhere to in my work, is this definition of the good life. So there's this framework written actually by an economist, a Nobel Prize winning economist whose name is Amartya Sen. And what he said was that the good life is made up of freedoms that are meaningful to people. I'm sorry, it's kind of academic. I'm really, I mean, um, so, um, so the short of it is that a good life is whatever life a person deems to be valuable. And this is very, very empowering, especially in development work, where a lot of organizations and a lot of people impose what a good life is and create programs and interventions from outside the context that they're delivering this intervention. This is why I also chose to, that's why it resonated so much with me, this framework. And you look into the local psychology literature, and it aligns with this framework that the Filipino conception of the good life is empowering in itself. So it says here, nararanasan dahil naabot ang hinahangad. Or a good life is one where a person has achieved what someone aspires for. So to be able to know this, then we also have to ask, what kind of life do Filipinos value? What do Filipinos aspire for? And in this particular context, we have to ask now, what kind of life do weavers value? And what do weavers aspire for? So this research is done in the context of handloom weaving. Okay, so why craft? In terms of its benefits, there are so many. Not just in terms of its economic benefits, where a lot of work has been focused on, and also culturally in terms of preserving it, but also psychologically, like what was discussed earlier. So there's so much literature, and I was so surprised as well to find there's so much literature around the psychological empowerment that craft brings. So, yes, income, but also a sense of connectedness, sense of belonging in crafting in a community, sense of self-worth that you are making something of value, and in identity maintenance, especially if a craft is still connected to the cultural meanings of the object. And at the same time, it's also very empowering exactly because it's connected to culture. That you are making something, you are materializing culture. And it gives back that sense of agency, that sense of control over a life that is often out of someone's control. We also, okay, I'm getting ahead of myself, but and like what was said earlier, craft in itself is fulfilling in its own activity that it leads to freedoms like access to education, health, etc. But it's also joy, it's also enjoyment, it's also a kind of freedom, kind of capability that a weaver or a crafter would find meaning in. But at the same time, craft can also abuse, which is another reason why I was so compelled as a social scientist to understand this context better. What are the things that are happening in this social, cultural, psychological context? And we often forget, like maybe we know off the top of our heads, but maybe we don't really consider how much how complex this context is, and how a lot of this complexity is brought about the interaction of the upper classes with the working class. Usually, very often, most artisans are from the working class, and the people who bring quote-unquote value to cultural crafted products are people from the upper classes, which we belong to, and we have to be reflexive of that fact in the way that we interact with people, in the creative design aesthetic decisions that we make. There are implications in the value of what we create with the artisans. So as a context that mediates access to income, power, and status, craft can abuse. As a context that assigns a class-based value to tradition, craft can abuse. So I'm not saying that designers, government agencies, NGOs, I'm not saying that they're bad people. I would count myself in that group of people, but we are, I'm sure, everybody here, we're all very well-meaning, but we also have to understand the dangers and the vulnerabilities that come with working in this sector. So, for this study, this is a pilot study, so the questions are very basic and the questions are very exploratory. So very broadly, I tried to understand, what do Filipino weavers desire? What is a good life for them? How do we understand this life of value and not give it to them, but build it with them? And also understand how they are currently experiencing or not experiencing ginhawa, good life well-being, through their craft, and what enables or impedes this. So in terms of methodology, I just spoke to 5 weavers in the southern Tagalog region, which is near Manila. And I use an indigenous psychological method called Pikipagkwentuhan, which might not sound formal to the Filipinos here, but that's the point, that it's organic to our culture, and that the questions and that the discussion is dominated by the weavers instead of the scientist. Yeah, so in trying to make sense of our discussion, I found this framework where their responses almost neatly fell into. Yeah, it's really, I really, as an academic, I try not to be academic. So, so I will go through this one by one, but it's still based on the capabilities framework. And this talks about how the good life is achieved through work. Okay. Okay, so I won't just go one by one and explain what they said, but I'll also try to impart some insights of what these things might mean. So the first insight is weaving is a tool to basic ginhawa, so like basic well-being or parang the things that make up what sustains people on a very basic level. That they're being fed, they're healthy. So just on the level of sustenance, weaving is a tool to achieve sustenance. But at the same time, weaving is sustenance in itself. So the way that the weavers articulated this is that they cannot, and this not certainly does not apply to all weavers, but to some weavers, there cannot be a day that they do not weave. And they find that to be important to their happiness. Even if it's not a very long time that they weave, as long as they weave every day, that's part of a good life. The danger with well, okay, I wouldn't say danger, but maybe the risk coming from our side. When weavers only see weaving as a tool to sustenance, then that tool can be anything else. If what they need really is money, and we should, of course, shouldn't blame them for wanting that and needing stability, then it'll be easy for them to choose a different way to earn this money. Yeah. And the second thing is that weaving is also a tool to higher ginhawas, higher well-beings that are beyond sustenance. So this can be as simple as leisure. So one of the cute things that the weaver said is that weaving gives them some extra income to go on dates with their husbands that they wouldn't have been able to do without weaving. And they talk about like certain fast food chains like Jollibee that they really look forward to being able to get Jollibee because they were able to earn income from their weaves. And again, weaving is a higher ginhawa, a higher sense of well-being in and of itself. So this is where self-fulfillment comes in. It's also in a more, like in a less grandiose way. Weaving is also leisure in itself. So it's not just a tool to access leisurely activities, but it's also fun and enjoyable for many weavers. And for some weavers, it's also ambition. They are very clear and very certain that they want to propagate weaving and that they want it to come back in their communities. So as a summary of this part, we see what weavers conceptualize a good life to be. So this good life for them is stable income, freedom from debt, and weaving every day. So the things in italics are weaving as freedoms in themselves. So higher ginhawa, so yes, access to leisure, but weaving also as leisure in itself, and weaving as fulfillment in itself. So the next part of the diagram would talk about how these available ginhawas become converted into actual ginhawa. And there are three categories of factors that come into play. And this is, I feel, where most organizations intervene. Yeah, so the factors that, okay, so there's personal, so in their individual attributes. So definitely age. In the Philippines, probably in other countries as well, most of the weavers are elderly. So that plays into how well they weave, because weaving is a very physical activity. And so health also comes into play. Education in terms of how they're able to sustain the business of weaving. Skill, how technically skilled are they in weaving? But also traits. So they would say things like, yeah, she's very good at weaving, but she's so lazy as a person overall. So that's also that, aside from the other things that we might expect, individual factors that would affect it. The second would be the social factors. um, for this particular group, it was a lot about the community that they belong in. So they belong to a cooperative which has a dwindling number of members, increasing, decreasing, depending on who wants to weave at a certain time. So even among the weavers themselves, there's a lot of resistance. And the idea of more orders is not always met with happiness. Exactly because they want to weave with joy, or they want to weave without pressure, or that weaving is only secondary to being mothers. But social factors are also very important to keep them weaving. So weaving together helps them pass the time faster because weaving is a very, very tedious activity. It also helps them with the technical skills. So for example, there's a new weaver that comes along who makes a mistake. Being with other weavers kind of trains that other weaver in a informal and in a more supportive way, other than like in a structure where someone is training, like a boss and a trainee. And lastly, environmental. So this is a social environment. So this is more on the macro level. So for this particular group of weavers, there's a lot that government did very directly to their experience of weaving in Ginhawa. So for example, the reason why their cooperative even exists is through a program called bottom-up budgeting, where the government went down to the local government units to find out and to ask, okay, LGU, what do you want? What do your constituents want and need? And you apply for it and then you fund it. So that's what their village, their barangay did. And then they got the funding eventually, which started their weaving house, gave them money for materials, training, etc. But at the same time, their local government is also allegedly very corrupt, in the sense that, well, okay, Philippine government is very corrupt, but in this specific case, it affected them very directly because in the change of the administration, just because one weaver was affiliated with the previous admin, the new admin took away their weaving house. And in so many poignant words, they would describe it as the government taking away their joy, the government taking away what they found meaning and fulfillment in. In terms of the free market, they also think that weaving is a stable business. I guess from their perspective, it's very stable because they get a lot of orders and they come randomly. They just arrive at their weaving house or at their actual homes and order. So in that sense, they don't feel that weaving is a dying economic enterprise. But it's also still very difficult because most of their opportunities, if not all their opportunities, are based in cities instead of the rural areas where they're based in. And also the availability of materials is nowhere near them. So they are outside of Manila, quite far from Manila, but they go all the way to this flea market called Divisoria just to be able to access cheaper threads. So the point here is that there's so much work and there's so much effort and so much budget that goes into these interventions, but is it able to keep up with the negative side of these same factors? Is it able to empower? Is it able to keep up with the disadvantages that keep on piling and piling on? But a way to break free from this is their exercise of agency and choice. So despite all of these difficulties, the weavers do show self-initiated things that they went out of the way for to get their weaving house off the ground. So it's not a joke to get a resolution off the ground in a local government unit, and that was something that they participated very actively in. They involved themselves in local government to be able to build a weaving house and to be able to stay there for a few years. They also utilized the connections they had with the local government, and these connections are not high up. It's more like, I know someone from the accounting section, and that person can like move the papers along. So in that sense, we see what's really important for them, because it's what they act on despite the many challenges that they face throughout it. Um, so far, what we can see is that weavers indeed are able to experience and access Ginhawa through their own agency and empowerment. And when I was doing this research, I was so happy because they presented as very empowered women. Like this weaver learned how to run a business on her own despite her health issues. Uh, so they didn't look like what you would imagine a disenfranchised group would look like. They're they're empowered women who are realizing and materializing what they think is a good life for themselves. But if you look even more closely into their experiences, what you see is that their successes are brought about by chance encounters. And these encounters are usually with the upper classes. So it's difficult to understand, it's difficult to maintain the stability of an enterprise like this if their successes are based on actions outside of their control. If the stability of their business is based on people randomly showing up at their weaving house, at their homes, that's something that they cannot control. And as of the last time that I spoke with them, there were no activities at that moment where they would proactively find these customers themselves. The arrival of the program that started their weaving house, that funded their weaving house, will also happen by chance. The exposure they get in the media also happened by chance by the same people who buy from them. So this is what scared me the most. Despite them, these women feeling so empowered, this empowerment is so fragile and can so easily be taken away by stronger forces that they cannot control. So that's scary because they won't have control over a life that they deem to be valuable. They won't be able to achieve a good life in their terms if they can't control so many factors around it. Even more, so as I said earlier, this whole framework is based on the idea that weaving is work, that weaving is an occupation. And the more that we spoke, it really became apparent that weavers do not view weaving as an occupation. It's not a job. It's a secondary job, maybe. It's a secondary source of income. Being a mother comes first. Being a daughter comes first. And this is very dangerous. And I guess like in my field, psychology, it's more difficult to communicate the value of this insight because it's a future danger instead of something that they're dealing with at the moment. So the problem with this is that this lack of clarity prevents them from associating the rightful protections that come with a job or a very clear idea that weaving is a business, maybe. And it also may explain their indiscriminate trust in people. So this manifests itself in the way that they charge for their services and their weaves. They don't ask for down payments because a lot of their customers are doctors. They're like, oh, they're doctors, they will pay us. But they don't ask them to sign a contract, an invoice, or anything like that. And even in relating to us, the researchers. So there is always confidentiality when you do research like this, and we have to ask them, give them the choice whether or not they'd like to be identified. To which they responded with a resounding yes, they'd like to be identified. But after speaking with my advisor, it was, at the end of it, their context is too dangerous, especially because of the political context that they're in. So you have to ask, why are they so trusting? How can we help them understand this context better? and how do we equip them to protect themselves as well. So this part is no longer part of my original study, but I wanted to try and figure out why they don't see weaving as an occupation. So I went back to their responses and some of my own anecdotal experience also with other weavers. So why isn't weaving seen as a 9 to 5? So number one, plausibly, it's because weavers grew up weaving only for themselves and their family. It was never a paid thing growing up for the weavers. They would make clothes for themselves and their family members. So the idea of getting paid for this is a new experience for them. So how do they navigate this novel experience now? And because of that, because they grew up with it, sometimes weaving is viewed as a household chore. It's very tedious. And especially if they refine the threads themselves, then all the more they don't always like to weave. So even if they find fulfillment in it, we also have to try and understand that it's not always fun. And lastly, they also see the continuing to weave as cultural preservation. They understand that their perseverance, their persistence in continuing to weave has an impact beyond themselves. And that also pushes them to maybe accept certain things that aren't maybe the best for them in terms of protecting their rights. So as a summary, this is the entire diagram of how weaving and how weaving as work contributes to the well-being of a weaver. So what it just says is that there's a cyclical nature to well-being and weaving. That weaving may be a tool to resources and the means to achieve goods and services, but it's also well-being in and of itself, in terms of self-fulfillment, in terms of weaving as a basic ginhawa, and how much this ginhawa is manifested in their life is affected by these factors, these green factors, that may or may not be within their control. And that ultimately, they exercise their freedom, and when they are able to exercise their agency and their choice. And that these two are affected by whatever they think a good life is. If they don't think that weaving is part of a good life, then they won't act on any of this, even if the opportunity is available to them. So as takeaways, it is not enough to understand development in craft as only economic and as only cultural. It is imperative to understand artisans as people with their own ideas of what a good life is, which in turn influences why they do what they do. And with the research, you usually find out that there are more questions than answers. So what is craft as a just occupation? What is craft as a just occupation in the new industries today? And is it even helpful to conceptualize craft as such? And finally, I'd like us to reflect on how do we reimagine craft as a context for agency, as a context where weavers don't only work for sustenance, but as a context where weavers are able to make a life and not a living. And I think this is what Adi was trying to make, the point that he was trying to make earlier, that money is not all. Money is not enough. We need to help them make a good life, to achieve upward mobility and ultimately achieve ginhawa, however they define it to be.